The Christian Nationalists are on the move. They are deploying a new narrative that is going to galvanize and consolidate support amongst many in the West. Here is Candace Owens on Piers Morgan Uncensored, which has over 1 million views in under 24 hours.
And the biggest issue, by the way, that I have with Israel in talking about them being above reproach is the fact that they are supplying the arms to murder Christians, okay? In Armenia, the oldest Christian country in the world, and yet nobody talks about that. For whatever reason, it seems to be the circumstance that when Jewish people die in Israel, it's wall-to-wall coverage. But when Christians die all over the world, nobody talks about it. Everyone wants to correlate everything to World War II. Everyone wants to talk about Adolf Hitler, and rightfully so, he was a horrific person. But nobody wants to talk about Henryk Yagoda, right? Nobody wants to talk about the Bolsheviks. Nobody wants to talk about the Christian Holocaust. I am tired of the media, exhausted of the media not speaking about what is happening to Christians all around the world. And it is especially horrific while at the exact same time that it is happening, the slaughter of Christians in Armenia, the arms being supplied by Israel, that the media turns the other way and says, oh, okay, but what about what's happening in Israel? So you know what I'm asking for? Actual equality. Okay, because it seems like this is like a special category, the special relationship that we have. I'm a Christian first, okay? And so my concerns are going to be with what's happening to Christians all around the world, because it is us. We are the #1 most persecuted religion in the world. And all Christians watching this need to realize the time is now to start speaking up, because we have been silenced about the things that are happening to us for a very long time. And the media is very clearly not our friend. When there is wall-to-wall coverage of Christians being killed in Armenia, Christians being killed in Nigeria, and the treatment of Christians in America and all across the globe today, then you ask me if I will use my platform and I will use my voice to speak about what's happening in Israel. How about that?
The archetypal power of the victim narrative is significant, and we're about to see this type of rhetoric from Christian nationalists escalate to new levels.
A consistent but almost never noted theme of American foreign policy is that it is always the Christians who suffer. When there's a war abroad that the United States is funding, it is Christians who tend to die disproportionately. And this goes back a long way, 60 years really, to Vietnam, where Catholics in that country were massacred, but it's accelerated. So, for example, during the more than a decade the U.S. government spent occupying Iraq, the ancient Christian community of Iraq was completely devastated. 9 out of 10 of them are no longer there. That was an effect of our foreign policy, but it was almost never noted in the United States, and almost never, ever even mentioned by Christian clergy in this country, many of whom supported that war and that occupation. Why is that?
Now, I want to be clear. When I say victim narrative, I don't mean false narrative. The examples that Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson cite are obviously very real. The danger of the victim narrative is not that it's false, but that it's incomplete. And you need to understand this if you want to have any understanding or influence when it comes to the political domain. Political narratives are technically partial retellings of deeper archetypal religious narratives, and it's their incompleteness that makes them dangerous.
Integrating narratives, and so those would include political narratives, integrating narratives have their force because they draw on universal archetypes. Otherwise they wouldn't have any power. Obviously, because they have to be concerned with the things that people find important, right? How can you sell a political message to someone if it isn't about something they find important? And if it's important to them, it's going to be grounded at least to some degree in their biological substructure. I mean, if you're talking to hungry people about food, it's a story that you can tell. The problem with political narratives, in my estimation, is that they can rapidly transform themselves into ideologies, and ideologies are dangerous for a variety of reasons, but the primary reason for their danger, I think, this is a hypothesis, is because of their one-sided nature. What happens is that they capitalize, parasitize, I think is even a better way of thinking about it, a profound underlying narrative, but they don't tell the entire story. And so then if you're looking for orientation in the world because you're fragmented and chaotic, and somebody provides you with a partial story, that's going to serve an integrating function. I could give you a quick example of that. I'll do it very quickly. So when the American West was settled, it was settled on the wave of an ideological story. Right. And here's the story. Heroic individual, that's positive, bringing positive culture, that's the wise king, into virgin or into chaotic territory. That's the negative mother, essentially. So that's positive individual, positive culture, negative nature, right? And that's a motivating story, man, to heroically bring order into the untamed wilderness. It's like 1 million people a year from Europe come driven by that narrative.
Yep.
It's okay, well, here's the counter narrative. Raping and pillaging individual, bringing the despoilations of tyrannical culture into the virginal, wonderful, environmental, what would you call it?
Utopia?
Yes, of nature.
Yep.
It's like, yeah, man, you can get a long way for that story too.
Yeah.
But they're both half the story. So you just put those two things together and you have a religious story. It's like, well, the individual is heroic, but also is an adversary, and a cruel adversary at that. Culture is the wise king, but it's also the evil tyrant. And nature is beautiful and wonderful French impressionistic landscape, and cancer, and Anopheles mosquitoes, and elephantiasis. And so if you are properly oriented in the world, you tell yourself both those stories, and you say, oh my God, they conflict. It's like, yeah, they do, man, that's exactly right.
Okay.
So an ideology just pulls out a subset of the religious characters and says, this is the entire reality.
Right,
it's like,
right.
no, it's not. Right. It's a parasitical meme,
Right.
essentially. An ideology is a parasitical meme on a religious substructure.
Understanding the psychological mechanisms that motivate political thought is important, but we also have to evaluate the mimetic fitness of these political narratives in the cultural context that they're in. Are Christians in the West truly victims? Well, it actually doesn't matter whether or not Christians are victims. What matters is the perception of victimization. When people rioted after the death of George Floyd, it was based largely on the perception that large numbers of unarmed black men are being targeted by the police, when in fact this was and continues to be a statistically provable falsehood. So the question is there enough material with which we can string together the perception that Christians are being victimized in the West, independent of whether or not it's true? To me, the answer is obviously yes. To pick one simple and arbitrary example is the degree to which popular culture seems to have embraced the aesthetic of Satanism. It probably seems silly to many of you watching this video, but when you sit down and think about it, to a Christian, Satan is the embodiment of pure evil. He's worse than Hitler, Ted Bundy, Stalin, whoever. For Hollywood to adopt this aesthetic and then couple it with all of the very real stories of disgusting, predatorial, and dare I say, satanic behavior emerging from that same Hollywood elite, it's not difficult for me at all to understand how a Christian might feel threatened by this. And then you have the general inversion of the sacred and profane, to put it in Durkheimian terms. The pride flag, which is degenerated so far from its original meaning, is treated like a sacred religious symbol in Western societies. Meanwhile, if you believe that your rights come from God, which is basic Christianity 101, you are a dangerous Christian nationalist.
Because there's many different groups orbiting Trump, but the thing that unites them as Christian nationalists, not Christians, by the way, because Christian nationalists is very different, is that they believe that our rights as Americans, as all human beings, don't come from any earthly authority. They don't come from Congress. They don't come from the Supreme Court. They come from God.
Now, the reason that I'm worried about the Christian nationalists digging in on the victim narrative is that it's the narrative that precedes mass violence. Think about any mass atrocity that has been committed in the past or is currently being committed by whatever side you pick, and then see if what's being said in this clip applies.
One of the things that Maya and I found when we were writing this paper, we were looking at the discourse that precedes genocide in genocidal states, and the enhancement of a sense of victimization on the part of one of the groups, usually the group that's going to commit the genocide. First of all, their sense of being victims is much heightened by the demagogues who are trying to stir up this sort of hatred. So they basically say, look, you've been oppressed in a variety of ways, and these are the people who did it, and they're not going to stop doing it, and this time we're going to get them before they get us. See, the problem as far as I'm concerned with it is it's not thought through very well, because there's a point that's being made, and the point is that people have been oppressed and they suffer. And that's true, that point. But then the proper framework from within which to interpret that, I believe, is that that's characteristic of life. You can't take it personally in some sense. And you can't divide the world neatly into perpetrators and victims. And you certainly can't divide the world neatly into perpetrators and victims and then assume that you're only in the victim class and then assume that that gives you certain, like access to certain forms of redress, let's say. It gets dangerous very rapidly if you do that sort of thing.
Now, I'm not suggesting we are on the verge of something genocidal, but we are definitely approaching some serious political upheaval come November, and the Christian nationalist meme complex is going to play a significant role in how all that plays out. So I'm going to keep an eye on things, and I think you should too. In the meantime, good luck and Godspeed.